Ladies and gentlemen, very much welcome to the Swedish Institute of International Affairs and a seminar that aims to separate some myths from facts about North Korea, a country absolutely central to world politics, yet little understood. And for those of you who have been following the news cycle this weekend, you might think that we are very skillful planners at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs to organize this kind of timely seminar. However, let me mention some events just during the last year concerning North Korea. In February last year, Kim Jong Un's half-brother, Kim Jongun, was killed at the Kuala Lumpur airport in Malaysia. In April, North Korea launched medium-range missiles. In July, North Korea test-fired a long-range missile, which some experts think could have the potential to reach Alaska in the United States. In August, the tension rose between the United States and North Korea over a North Korean threat to fire ballistic missiles near the United States territory of Guam in the Pacific. Then, in September, North Korea launched its sixth nuclear weapon test at the United Nations headquarters in New York City. US President Donald Trump stated that Rocket Man is on a suicide mission. In November, North Korea launched yet another intercontinental ballistic missile test. In January this year, in a new development, the first talks in 2 years took place between the North and South Koreas. And then, in February this year, at the Winter Olympics in South Korea, the two Koreas march in together for the opening ceremony. They fielded a joint women ice hockey team that lost to Sweden 8-0, I'm sorry to say. And also the North Korean delegation to South Korea, who also visited during the Olympics, including Kim Jong Un's sister, extended an invitation to South Korea's president to meet with North Korea's leader. And most recently, last week, news appeared about Kim Jong Un willing to meet with US President Donald Trump and Trump accepting the invitation. So today's seminar is not only about our skillful planning, it's also the result of a very, very eventful year on the Korean Peninsula. And I'm very happy today to have two great speakers to help us to separate myth and reality about North Korea. First, to my left, very much welcome to Stockholm, Sweden, to Loretta Napoleoni, a well-known journalist and political analyst. Loretta, you have been written extensively on a number of topics concerning international affairs, such as terrorism, economics, and not the least the link between terrorism and economics. Loretta has authored several well-received non-fiction books, as well as fiction, and is regularly writing for world-leading newspapers. And this new book, North Korea, landet vi älskar att hata, is just out, the Swedish edition on Fri Tanke Förlag. And that is a starting point of our discussion today. So very much welcome, Loretta, to the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And to my left, we have Ulf Hansen. Ulf is a research fellow at the European Institute of Japanese Studies at Stockholm School of Economics, and also an associate research fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. He got his PhD at Freie Universität in Berlin, and he's been writing, among other things, about how Japan's wartime experience influences Japan's foreign and security policy, as well as Japan-North Korea relations. So very much welcome to both of you. And I would like first to give Loretta the word for for a short lecture, and then we give it to Ulf. Then I will engage the speakers in some discussion, and toward the end of the seminar, we will open up for a Q&A with the public. And before we start, I just want to mention that if you are out on Twitter, please use the hashtag #UIEvent. And also, before I give the word to Loretta, her book is available to buy outside this lecture hall. Please.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for being here. I must say that this book, the decision to write this book actually took place at my publisher house during a dinner. And the people that were there are all here. And we had the discussion, and I said, I've been really investigating North Korea because there are so many fake news about this country. And they said, wow, that's a good idea. Maybe, writing a short book explaining people what is really happening is not something that we shouldn't do. And we did it. So I'm very pleased to be here today and to have the finished product. So it is true that if we had this lecture last year, we would be talking about something completely wrong because it's the truth that last year we thought that we were very close to a nuclear war confrontation between Donald Trump and Kim Jong Un. We also had this idea that Kim Jong Un was a completely deranged individual. We still have the same idea about Donald Trump sometimes, but so the world is totally different today. We have a meeting that is even possible that will take place in Sweden between Donald Trump and Kim Jong Un, something that would have been completely irrational and absurd. And I think because things have changed so quickly that we have gone from the potential nuclear holocaust to the peace between North Korea and the US and possibly even Japan and for sure South Korea, we have not understood how exceptional this moment is. I think what we have been witnessing, really, it is a superb and absolutely outstanding political maneuvering of modern diplomacy. And this was masterminded by new politicians, people that are completely different from the politicians that we have known until a few years ago. And I would say that we are witnessing a moment which is very similar to Glasnost or Perestroika. We haven't seen anything like that since those years. So we're talking about a very long time. So who are the actors of this transformation of the world? Well, I would say that the first political master is actually Kim Jong Un. Kim Jong Un, a millennial, somebody that until 2 or 3 months ago we thought he was a grotesque individual. Everybody was making fun of him because he's fat and he has an absurd haircut. We also thought that he was a sort of puppet in the hands of the elite, that he could not be possibly in charge of that country. Well, this is completely false because he has proven to be a very skillful politician. He also has proven to be part of this new political elite and leadership at world level, which, yes, they are very much populist, nationalistic, narcissistic, exactly as the U.S. President of the United States. But this is a key point because he belongs to these new politicians. And the reason why this new politician exists is because the West and the world has decided to go anti-establishment. I mean, look around at yourself. So there is this new movement, and this is what Kim Jong-un has been exploiting for the last few years. The fact that politics is not conducted in the way it was conducted before. The other master is, of course, President Moon. President Moon, to a certain extent, has danced since he was elected with Kim Jong Un. He didn't react too badly to the ballistic missiles test of 2017, but he responded immediately to the hint of the possibility for the North Korean to participate to the Winter Olympics. And he has used the Olympic diplomacy in order to achieve what everybody thought was going to be impossible, an actual conversation between the North and the South about the possibility of peace. I remind you that the two countries are still at war. There was only an armistice. There was never a peace treaty. But above all, he managed to lock the US, and in particular Donald Trump, into an agreement to meet in May with Kim Jong Un. So the third one, of course, is Donald Trump. Is Donald Trump because the guy has been totally unpredictable, and he has done the unpredictable and the impossible, which is all of a sudden he has agreed to meet Kim Jong Un. He has not consulted with his staff. And this is a new form of politics. Imagine President Obama doing something like this. He would have had 17 meetings. He would have, then tested with the media. Then he would have to organize, the diplomacy. It would have taken months and months and months. Here, Donald Trump woke up in the morning, he got the tweet, he saw that Kim Jong-un was actually willing to have that famous hamburger with him, and he said, why not? Let's do it. But this is the politics of today. And I think if we have one single chance here to achieve peace in the Pacific, to contain, not denuclearize because it'll never happen, but to contain North Korea. But above all, to bring North Korea back into the international community and to stop being the army state, the only way is to have this kind of a totally flexible, unpredictable politics. So I am fairly optimistic, actually. Okay, so how did we get here? Now, North Korea, since the 1950s, has been the country we love to hate. It's been, the benchmark of evil. It has been perceived, for a start, as one of the worst possible communist country during, the Soviet regime, within the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. Of course, the country is not even communist, but that doesn't matter because it was on the border between the West and the East during the Cold War. It was the first country created after World War II, product of the Cold War. So it had to be total evil, and this is the last evil standing of those years. So it is somehow comforting to have a country like this existing. And I'll tell you why. Because, since the 89, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, globalization has been used to export democracy and the free market everywhere. And frankly, the results in certain countries are not so good. I'm just thinking about Libya, I'm thinking about Iraq, Afghanistan. People blow up every day because of terrorist activity. But the simple fact that we have the evil benchmark in North Korea makes us look at this country as not a complete total failure. Because you can always say, well, yeah, people are not very happy in Baghdad, but my God, at least it's not Pyongyang. And that is the approach. Well, this is about to change. Because if we make a deal, things will change. Then we'll be without the one single country that we can really hate. We'll be without the evil benchmark. Anyway, we'll see. So I said North Korea was never a communist country. At the end of the Korean War in 1953, Kim Il-sung, who is the founder of the country, he actually understood that North Korea could have been swallowed up by China or the Soviet Union, which are the two countries on his border. So he needed to create something different from communism in order to protect its own country. And this is when he came out with this idea, which is called Juche. It is, the most difficult, non-coherent philosophy you can come across, but it actually works very well in North Korea because of the peculiarity, I would say, of the country and the people. It is a nationalist ideology, and is based upon the purity of the North Korean race. So imagine, we're talking about 1950s. This is after World War II. This is when the word race in Europe could not even be pronounced. This is, after the Holocaust. And yet, in this little corner in Asia, somebody built up a new nation based upon the purity of the race. The Juche is also the ideological base upon which the North Korean can describe their superiority vis-a-vis the South Korean. Now, in 1918, the Korean Peninsula was colonized by Japan, and the North and the South took different routes. The South was much more pro-Japanese, the Japanese conducting a sort of decorization cultural campaign. They wanted to assimilate completely the Koreans. They even forced people to change their names from Korean names to Japanese names. But the resistance was in the North. So the North was where the War of Independence started, and this is where it was conducted. Kim Il-sung was the leader. He moved to Manchuria at a certain point, and from Manchuria carried on this fight. So because of all of that, the North has always looked at the South as a sort of cooperator of the Japanese. Now, things got very, very complicated, of course, at the end of the war, because at the end of the war, the Korean Peninsula was divided in two. At the 38 parallel, and the South was occupied by the Americans, and the North was under the control of the Russians, and this is how Kim Il-sung managed to create North Korea. But the idea is that the North is purer in terms of race than the South, because the North did not the North fought against the Japanese. It did not give up its own identity as the South did. So on the basis of that, what we see is not at all a communist country. When you watch on TV all those parades, right, and the commentators, when they do the parades, they always say, "Oh, this reminds us, of the big parades in the Red Square in Moscow, or in Beijing." Well, it's not true. If you look at those parades, what you should think is the parade of the Roman Empire. This is not a communist country. This is a country based upon a dynasty. The Kim dynasty, which is a blood dynasty. The Juche gives them the legitimation of this blood dynasty. So from father to son, power is transmitted. There is no power struggle in order to achieve control of the leadership. This is also a country where the nation is organized in blood caste. So depending on the family you come from, how close that family is to the War of Independence conducted by Kim Il-sung, and how close that family is to the Kim Il-sung dynasty, then you are in a high caste or in a low caste. And you know what? There is no social mobility whatsoever. This is more similar to how was the dynastic power of Asia in the Middle Age than how it was around the Soviet Union in the 1970s. So anyway, it is a unique country. It's completely different from any other countries. So the racial superiority, which is extremely eradicated, has become very conducive to the policy of self-reliance. So because they feel superior to everybody else, they also feel that they can withstand anything. And this is how they survived the implosion of the Soviet Union. And this is also how they survived the famine of the late 1990s. In the 1990s, between 600,000 to 1 million people in North Korea starved to death. And yet, there was not one single attempt to overthrow the regime. And I want to open a very brief parenthesis here. The sanction, do you know why we impose sanction upon certain countries? We impose sanction upon certain country because the harshness, the economic harshness produced by the sanction will force the people to overthrow the existing regime, which happened to be a regime that we do not like. This is what's happened with Iraq. Of course, it didn't work out. But this is what is happening here also with Kim Jong Un. So last year, all those rounds of sanctions were aimed at forcing the people to overthrow the regime. Now, how can you do something like that if this is a country that has survived a famine where almost 1 million people died without doing anything? So this is also shows the misinterpretation and the misunderstanding that we have vis-a-vis this country. So it's almost like the mythology has taken over the reality, and we do not distinguish anymore facts from fiction. So the nuclear program. So Kim Il-sung in the 1950s expressed the need to start a nuclear program. He understood that the only way to protect the country from any future attack, from another absolutely terrible experience, as it was the Korean War. The Korean War destroyed about 80% of the city of the north, and I would say almost 80% also of the south. It was a devastating, an absolutely devastating war. So the only way to prevent another tragedy, a catastrophe like this, was to achieve nuclear power. So it has been systematically the policy of North Korea to become a nuclear power since the 1950s. It was the most important, it was the priority of Kim Il-sung, it was the priority of his son, Kim Jong-un, and it became the priority of the grandson of Kim Jong-un. The difference here is that Kim Jong-un came to power at a certain moment in history, and he's also a completely different individual from the father and the grandfather. He's a millennial. He has no concept, no idea of the Cold War. He was brought up in the technological era. So he had a completely different approach to how do we achieve this goal. I mean, for a start, he understood that the country needed to grow economically. He understood that it was impossible to maintain control without giving something to the people. So he introduced economic tolerance that lifted the country from the subsistence economy, but at the same time, he continued his nuclear program. And what he did that the predecessor didn't do is he realized that it was pointless to spend money for an army, a conventional army. Conventional army is obsolete. All the money should have gone to the nuclear program. And this is exactly what's happened. So in 2017, he gambled. I think he really gambled. I think he provoked Trump. He launched the missiles to establish North Korea as a nuclear power. And once that became a certainty, which he did, he stopped in November 2017. And then he sent the olive branch to the south, an olive branch that was not sent by a country that is poor, by a country that is starving, but it was sent by the newest nuclear country in the world. And it worked. It absolutely worked. So he dictated without us realizing his own conditions. And here we are, the Americans are coming to the table. So what's going to happen? Well, I think there will be an agreement for a peace treaty between the North and the South. There will be a draft agreement between the US and North Korea. Of course, Trump will present it as his victory. This draft agreement will be needed to be put together before the midterm election, because that will be a tremendous boost for the election for Trump, and for sure it will. They're not going to conclude the agreement for several years, but the basis will be there. The DPRK will not renounce its nuclear weapons, as didn't Pakistan, India, or Israel. It will be yet another member of the so-called nuclear powers that we don't want them to be nuclear powers, but they are nuclear powers. We'll find a way to present it to the world. And then finally, the most important thing is the peace with the South will be very beneficial to the North because they will start trading. So there will be a relaxation of restriction in the North. It's going to be a little bit like what's happening in China with Deng Xiaoping. But don't be fooled. The regime will maintain the control. So the country will never be totally open. There will always be the Kim dynasty. They are in control. But things will be better. For sure, they'll be better than they are today.
Okay. Loretta, thank you so much for a really fascinating talk. And let's give her a hand. Before we move on to Ulva, I would like to ask you, because also with the background of this recent events about the news, about the meeting coming up between Kim Jong Un and Donald Trump, because when I hear you speaking, it sounds that you give sort of the North Koreans a lot of credit here for their very skillful diplomatic maneuvers leading up to sort of creating the conditions where they can meet with the Americans. They can arrange this meeting. I would like to ask you, however, about sort of an alternative interpretation that you hear sometimes in the media and among experts, and that is that with the new rounds of sanctions this year from the United Nations Security Council, also supported by Russia and most importantly by China, North Korea is getting more and more isolated, and maybe the sanctions didn't start to bite that much yet, but they sort of see it coming. And this combined with a very hard and threatening rhetoric coming out of the United States about attacking North Korea, some people believe that the North Koreans, they feel really isolated now, and they see that things are just going to get worse and they need a way out. And that explains the background of this attempt to meet now with the Americans. What do you think about this view?
Well, I disagree with this view because what the Americans have been saying systematically, I mean, for administration, including the Trump administration, is that they would not sit down to the table until the North Korea had renounced their nuclear program, and the North Koreans have not renounced their nuclear program. What the North Koreans are doing is not launch any missiles during this period, which is also the Olympics. This was the agreement. But I don't think they need to launch any more missiles. I mean, if the aim is to prove that they can hit the United States, I think, they have done it. We know that they have ballistic missiles that can go intercontinental and reach at least the west coast of the United States. Well, we don't know if they have managed to miniaturize the bomb so that these missiles can actually carry it. But would you risk it? I wouldn't, and I don't think the Americans would. So this is why I disagree. I think the North Koreans actually won because they are getting the Americans to the table without giving up their weapons.
So basically, get the Americans to the table without giving any concessions, right? Very skillful indeed,
Yeah.
if that is the case, and if this meeting will happen. Thank you very much, Loretta. We will continue the discussion later. But first, please, Ulf Hansen.
All right, thank you very much, Björn. So I will speak about a topic that unfortunately, but perhaps understandably, is often overshadowed by the nuclear issue. And that topic is the marketization of North Korea. And I do understand that probably many of you are eager to discuss the latest developments between Washington and Pyongyang. And I'd be happy to do so during the Q&A session. But for the next 15 minutes, let's focus on marketization in North Korea. So what is marketization in North Korea? Well, as Loretta pointed out, North Korea is often characterized as some sort of a Stalinist plan economy, but that's simply not a very accurate picture of North Korea. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, the North Korean economy collapsed with it. North Korea was extremely dependent on imports from the Soviet Union at subsidized friendship prices. So when these imports stopped coming in, for example, oil and fertilizer and spare parts, the North Korean state was no longer able to provide its people with food and other necessities. So famine, as Loretta pointed out, soon broke out. And that was completely disastrous, killing between 3 and 5% of the entire population. So when the North Korean state failed to, or as the North Korean state was no longer able to take care of its own population, the ordinary North Koreans had no other options but to get together and barter and do trade on makeshift markets. And the North Korean state had no other alternative but to accept this because it didn't have any alternative in place. So the origin of North Korean marketization is found in the famine in the 1990s. And since then, marketization has become very institutionalized in North Korea. There are about 400 state-authorized huge markets called Jangmadang in North Korea. These markets they're very big. They actually have, on average, 1,500 stalls. And they're technically illegal, but as I said, the government has no other option but to tolerate them. And since the state salary is not sufficient to survive on, most North Koreans supplement their income at these markets. And it's estimated that North Koreans earn somewhere between 60 and 100% of their total income at these markets. So they're extremely important to the North Korean people, average people. And so what does marketization in North Korea, how does this affect North Korean society? Well, it affects North Korean society in a number of different ways, and some are positive and some are negative. As for the positive consequences, I can mention that marketization has led to improved living standards, although we shouldn't exaggerate that, and also increased access to technology and information. And North Korea has become more interconnected than ever before, as we have seen new means of transportation, such as private bus services, and new means of communication, such as the spread of mobile phones. And one of the most interesting developments in this regard is the spread of outside information into North Korea, and especially South Korean popular culture. Despite being illegal, South Korean movies and dramas and music have become extremely popular in North Korea. And according to some defector interviews, there are estimates that as much as 70 to 80% of North Koreans watch South Korean movies on a regular basis. But that's, of course, impossible to verify. But we know also that young North Koreans often try to sort of emulate the fashion and the slang they see and hear in South Korean popular culture. And speaking of young people, one demographic group that we should keep an eye on is the so-called Jangmadang generation, the market generation. And the Jangmadang generation is basically the North Korean equivalent to what we in the West sometimes refer to as millennials. So that is people in their 20s and 30s. But unlike the millennials in the West, who are often stereotyped as being lazy, the North Korean Jangmadang generation is extremely industrious and creative. And these people, they grew up in the 1990s during the famine, so they had to get tough and self-reliant in order to survive. And these people have, known no other system than capitalism in North Korea. They've never experienced a fully functioning socialist system. So they are said to be more rebellious and industrious and self-reliant than previous generations. And perhaps more importantly, they are said to be inclined to be more inclined to challenge state authority. And predictably, due to the largely unchecked spread of capitalism in North Korea, there are also negative consequences, such as corruption and income inequality. And corruption has really become a major problem in North Korea. It's become a systemic problem. And since the markets are technically illegal, market vendors are often subject to random demands for bribes by patrolling police officers. So this has really become part of the North Korean system. And if you have money in North Korea today, you can basically bribe your way out of any situation, any predicament. Kim Jong Un at Seoul National University published a book last year called Unveiling the North Korean Economy, in where he makes an estimate based on defector interviews. And he writes that the average North Korean household actually spends as much as 9% of its budget on bribes. So that would effectively make North Korea one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Now, can marketization in North Korea lead to some sort of political change? So far, North Korea, or actually the North Korean state, has responded very in a very ambiguous way towards the markets, accommodating the markets one day and cracking down on the markets the next. But I think in the long term, marketization in North Korea will lead to some form of liberalization. And I think so because marketization erodes state power. More specifically, it erodes the state's ability to control its own people. So traditionally, the state's ability to control its own population has rested on three pillars. The first one being a monopoly on force, and the second one being a monopoly on information, and the third one being legitimacy, more specifically legitimacy through reciprocal state-people relations. So these were the three pillars that enabled the state to really strictly control its own people in the past. However, now all three pillars have gradually begun to shake and crumble a little bit due to marketization. So let me explain that a little bit. As for the first pillar, the monopoly on force, that is obviously still intact. It's a strong pillar. And the state's threshold to use force in order to control its own people is still extremely low. However, the spread of bribery and corruption offers possibilities to avoid punishment for many, if not most, crimes. So obviously, this empowers potential regime challengers because now they have the opportunity to circumvent state repression to some degree, but it's still a very strong pillar. Now, the second pillar, monopoly on information, that is simply not there anymore. The state does not have an absolute monopoly on information. Thanks to the spread of new technology, the North Koreans today have an unprecedented access to outside information. And the government can no longer dictate the narrative on all aspects of social life, nor can it hide the success of South Korea vis-a-vis North Korea. And I think in the long term, the spread of information about South Korea is probably the gravest long-term threat to the North Korean state, because there's simply no easy way to explain the huge discrepancy between North and South Korea without pointing to the different political systems, thus admitting the flaws of North Korean socialism. So I think outside information really reveals the successes of other countries and the dysfunctionalities of North Korea. Now, the third pillar, which is legitimacy through reciprocal relations between the state and the people, is probably the pillar that has weakened the most. Now, the North Korean state has always been extremely demanding of its own people, but in the past it also gave something back. So the North Korean state demanded absolute loyalty and labor, but in return it gave the people food and a certain degree of welfare and basic necessities. So there was a degree of reciprocity in the relationship between the state and the people. And this, of course, conferred legitimacy onto the regime and the leadership. However, today, the state is still extremely demanding of its own people, but it hardly gives anything back. So the public distribution system has been in a state of disrepair for 20 years, and people who only rely on the state, they simply can't survive in today's North Korea. So, for example, people in the Jangmadang generations, the millennials, they have very little incentive to be loyal to the state because, as I said, they've never experienced a fully functioning socialist system. So to them, the state is not an enabler of better lives, it's an obstacle to better lives. And I think as long as the relationship between the state and the people lacks any semblance of reciprocity, the state's legitimacy will continue to weaken. So that means that all three pillars, to varying degrees, are being weakened. All three pillars that have upheld the state's ability to control its own people. And I think it will continue to weaken unless the state does something. So I think doing nothing for the North Korean state is really not an option. And abolishing the markets is not really an option either because it doesn't have the capacity to reinstate the public distribution system, nor does it have the capacity or creativity to come up with alternatives to the markets. So I think the most likely scenario going forward is a scenario in which the North Korean state gradually comes to embrace the markets, try to profit from it, and facilitates market activity through careful economic reform, much like we saw in China in the late 1970s and 1980s. And this would, of course, require a relaxation on the restrictions on movement, on assembly, on communication, and it would also require an unambiguous recognition of the markets as legal. And I think there are some indications that Kim Jong-un is actually going in this direction. And if that's really the case, then I think it's a smart move, because if he manages to facilitate market activity, which is going to happen anyway, then he can portray himself as this reformer that can take credit for the improvement in North Koreans' lives. So I think if Kim Jong-un plays his cards right, he can actually benefit from marketization. But again, I think it will require some degree of liberalization of the North Korean system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ulf. I would like to ask the first question to you, Ulf. So you ended your talk by saying that it's likely that the North Korean regime will have to embrace this trend toward marketization. But the question then to me would be, wouldn't this risk turning North Korea into a second-rate South Korea, right? Mm. If they embrace core features of the South Korean system, and the North Korean population is seeing the regime doing this, but at the same time, they see that we don't get the same freedoms that the South Koreans have, and, you know, the level of economic discrepancy between the two countries will still be enormous. So why would the North Korean leadership do this? Wouldn't this be an enormous risk to them? And even though it might be difficult to completely stop the marketization, shouldn't we instead expect them to try as, you know, far as they can to prevent these trends from accelerating?
Yeah, so in a 15-minute presentation, you don't really get to develop all your arguments. So this is where I backtrack. But yeah, I think you're right. It does provide, it does pose a risk to the North Korean leadership, and of course, they would not want to be a second-rate South Korea. But I wonder, what is the alternative? And also, I think if there's one thing the North Korean leadership has been very good at, it's been making the people accept the state narrative. So if they manage to swing this narrative from being like this second-grade South Korea into focusing on the actual achievements of the Kim Jong-un leadership compared to, for example, his father, whose legacy is really tainted by the famine. Like if you manage to do that comparison instead, like a temporal comparison, look at where we are now as compared to where we were in the 1990s, instead of the geographical comparison, look at where we are compared to South Korea, then I think, yeah, why wouldn't that be possible? I think it's possible. But I also think that maybe the current leadership doesn't really have much of a choice, because I mentioned this Jangmadang generation, the North Korean millennials. One thing that's really important to keep in mind is that this generation is only gonna get bigger. Like, it's not one generation among many. In the future, we will be talking about Jangmadang generations in the plural. So this is the default mindset of North Koreans also in the future. This is not like a generation that will pass anytime soon. So I think the pressures will simply be too big. and maybe I'm too naive to believe in like the North Korean public opinion, but I was criticized for being too Nordic by my boss, Marisa, and maybe I am, but I think there's a good chance that the pressures will become too strong for the North Korean leadership to actually ignore.
So Loretta, how do you see the prospects of economic change in North Korea, and also how it plays into relations with South Korea? Because you ended your talk also about sounding pretty optimistic about the prospects in the near future for improvement of North-South Korean relations.
Well, I agree actually with Ulf about this analysis that we should not really talk about one generation, but a new generation. I mean, things have changed dramatically since the 1990s. But I would say that because of this sort of nationalism, because of this idea to be the purest of the purest race, the simple fact that the North is a nuclear power and the South is not, it's already a very strong edge from the North. I think it's source of tremendous power. Even if they do not like the leadership or whatever, even if the economic conditions are not as good as in the South, and not many people can do that comparison very well. I think Kim Jong Un is very popular at the moment, extremely, but definitely much more popular than his father. Is as popular, I would say, as it was Kim Il Sung, the the founder of the nation. So if the leadership can maintain this kind of admiration, I think many things can be achieved. The other thing is that North Korea is one of the a few countries in the north, I mean, because of course we have also Africa, that have not been developed. I mean, so the opportunities, it's a bit like, when China opened up in the 70s, or actually in the 80s, it's also a very rich country. I mean, resources, mines. So that could play in the hands of the regime if it's done in the right way. That can bring a lot of prosperity. The population is not very big, so you do not need. I mean, we're not talking about China here. We're talking about a relatively small country. There are problems in agriculture, and well, you know better than me, I'm pretty sure about that. That they completely destroyed the agriculture in the north. After the implosion of the Soviet Union, because they cut the trees, they were encouraged to cut the trees in order to produce fuel, because all of a sudden they had to pay fuel at market prices. And this is the origins of the famine, by the way, because they were encouraged to cut the trees and to plant in these sloping lands. Then they were hit in the mid 1990s by one of the first phenomena of this freak weather phenomenon due to global warming. So they had 2 years of floods, 1 year of drought, and then they had a tidal wave, they had tsunamis. So in these circumstances, the agricultural system completely collapsed because of what they had done, and also because of the weather pattern. And this is when they open up. This is when the marketization came, blah, blah, blah. So I think the agriculture is their weak point. And I think they have to invest in agriculture. There's a lot of money going to North Korea from international organizations to replant the sloping lands already. I mean, Switzerland, for example, has a huge plan which has been in place for the last 6 or 7 years. So, but it takes time. I think that is where they will have a problem if they don't do it properly, because of course food is still not abundant, and food is required.
if we try to connect this issue about marketization and potential economic change with the geopolitics surrounding North Korea, it seems to me that in order for these processes to move forward, North Korea's economy can't be cut off from the rest of the world. And what we have today is pretty massive sanctions in place. Where China, North Korea's biggest trading partner by far, is also part of this. If I start by asking you, Ulf, let's say that this sort of positive momentum continues now, and the leaders of both Koreas will meet in April, and then Kim and Trump will meet in May. But from an American perspective, right, the sanction will stay in place until North Korea commits to start getting rid of its nuclear weapons. And at least according to Loretta and a lot of other observers, it's not very likely that they will do that. So is it then possible to combine some kind of economic engagement with the outside world while these sanctions are still in place? Or how is it possible for North Korea to escape this conundrum?
I really don't think it's possible to hope for any positive development of the economy as long as the sanctions remain in place. And I'm also I'm not unfortunately as positive to or hopeful of the upcoming meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong Un as Loretta seems to be, because I think Donald Trump has invested so much political capital in criticizing the horrible deals of other presidents before him. And this is his chance at making a deal that will be remembered forever, not forever, but for a long time. And if he walks right into the same trap as every other American president that has tackled this issue, then, I mean, it's a huge loss for him. Maybe he doesn't care about that, but I think he does. And so I think if he cuts a deal with North Korea, which does not commit North Korea to denuclearization, he will be ridiculed. I mean, that will be a huge loss for him in the upcoming elections. So I don't think he's willing to do that. And at the same time, neither do I think that North Korea is willing to trade away its nuclear weapons. I mean, they, just like Donald Trump has invested a lot of political capital in sort of being tough on North Korea. North Korea has invested a lot of political capital in the prestige of nuclear weapons. I mean, not just the deterrence factor, like that's obvious, but also the prestige of nuclear weapons. It's even written into the constitution that North Korea is a nuclear state. So how is Kim Jong Un gonna just backtrack from this rhetoric that has dominated like all public statements coming out of North Korea for the past almost 10 years, that the nuclear weapons program is non-negotiable? I simply don't see it happening. So I am unfortunately pretty pessimistic.
What's your take, Loretta?
Well, I think that the structure of the non-proliferation protocol and agreement is completely wrong. If I were Donald Trump, I would go, big. I would not go only, let's get an agreement with North Korea. I would go about, let's rewrite the non-proliferation protocol, which, if you think about, is exactly the same thing that happened when Glasnost and Perestroika. I mean, they started opening up, and then they could not carry on without redesigning. It was the SALT agreement, right? Redesigning the entire structure of nuclear weapons. I mean, the nuclear weapons is a political issue. It's not a military issue. they thought that any of those countries is going to use a nuclear weapon. It's ridiculous. I mean, this is something that people must understand, and this is also something that politicians must put through to the people, and it has to be built in the agreements. The only reason why a country will use a nuclear weapon if it's the only chance to survive. So if Donald Trump was threatening Kim Jong Un to attack him, as several generals, I mean, I remember reading an article in Bloomberg, which was absolutely science fiction kind of article, because this general was saying, oh well, now we have the GPS weapons. I don't know if you saw it. We have this GPS guided weapon, so we can actually attack them, go inside the bunker where the nuclear weapons are. And no, we cannot destroy the nuclear weapon, but we can destroy the mechanism to switch them on. And I thought, come on, it's science fiction. So I think we need a new approach to nuclear weapon, meaning there are countries which, of course, they have it, and we're happy for them to have it, but there are other countries that will become nuclear powers, and we have to accept it.
But I can understand the point, but at the same time, Donald Trump, he doesn't really strike me as the guy intent on go into negotiations about this very complicated multilateral arrangement about nuclear proliferation and so on. So if we return to the current situation, then with possible events here going forward, do you think that the United States in some way could accept, even if not officially, a nuclear North Korea, and engage with it economically, and maybe in return for some test freeze and so on, cut some sanctions? Do you think that's a real possibility for the near future?
Well, they accepted a nuclear Pakistan. Mm-hmm. I mean, why shouldn't they accept a nuclear North Korea? Frankly, I think Pakistan is much more dangerous than North Korea. So, I mean, why did we accept them accepted a nuclear Pakistan? Because Bush needed Pakistan. There was a necessity for his administration to make a deal with Pakistan. And by the way, the Saudis paid the so-called fine that they impose upon Pakistan. So Donald Trump needs this deal. And he is the man of the deal. In fact, it's in the book. He is known in America as the man of the deal. He's the businessman that makes everything possible. So, and he's super narcissistic. So, I think because of these circumstances, yes, it may happen. Of course, we don't know. Everything's so unpredictable, as I said before, in this world. But I think there is a possibility, which, of course, it was not there with Obama. Obama would never, ever have accepted it.
Thank you. And let's continue this discussion now together with the audience. And I got two questions here already. First, the lady in purple, and then the man in the tie behind him. And please start by introducing yourself and pose short questions to the speakers.
Yes, my name is Darja Kronberg, and I'm a nuclear specialist from CIPRI, and I especially worked with Iran negotiations for a long time. And I would like to, we are talking about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and it's true that I don't think the North Koreans will go along with total denuclearization. But there's this possibility, there's a difference between Iran and North Korea. Iran did not have nuclear weapons, but they are happy to be on the threshold, to be able to break out within a certain time. Would you think that North Korea would go along with this kind of threshold position with a breakout time for some time? And just a short question also, we're talking about the marketization and so forth. I was in November in Washington about a seminar on one Korea. And there's obviously a dream on both sides of one Korea, and when they march under one flag. How do you see this idea? one Korea.
So before you reply to this excellent question, Loretta, let's take 2 more questions. We take them in a bunch. First, we got the gentleman there, and then the man in the white shirt.
Thank you very much. My name is Mats Engman, former Major General, recently returned after serving in the DMC between North and South Korea for 2 years. One question each for the 2 panelists. First to you, Ms. Loretta. You mentioned in your presentation about possibility of some kind of peace agreement or peace treaty with the upcoming meetings. Do you see that peace treaty as the precursor to a 2-state solution or to a reunification? And to you, Mr. Hansen, you mentioned this about the young Daman generation. Do you see this as a breeding ground for some kind of political opposition, or do you more see them as looking after themselves and their families? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then we got one more question here, the gentleman.
My name is Kjell Lundqvist from European Labour Party and the Schiller Institute. I think you forgot that China just now is totally changing the world with this Belt and Road initiative. Isn't it the case that they have marketizing, as you said, the whole China? Why should not North Korea be able to do the same? And if the sanctions gets away and North Korea join immediately the Belt and Road Initiative, will that not solve the problem for North Korea?
Okay. I don't think that Iran is a good example because the North Koreans have the nuclear weapon. Is in the constitution, as Ulf said before. So I don't think they're going to give it up. It's really very much part of the essence of the nation. I also think that the nation has been built to protect. I mean, that's the concept, to protect the people. So we have the colonization of Japan, which is super brutal. Then we have the Korean War, which is even worse in terms of destruction. So it is a necessity. I mean, they perceived the world as something very dangerous. When you talk to the factors, you can get it from the factors also. Then they still have this nostalgia. And then when they describe their life there, it's almost cozy to a certain extent because that's North Korea, because it's the most beautiful country in the world. I mean, it is possible the new generations will be different, but for sure the situation now is such. You can't say the same thing of Iran. So, no, I don't think they'll give it up. About the 2 Koreas, I think there is a very strong desire from the South, but less from the North. Number one, if you have one Korea, which Korea is going to be? Because I mean, look at Germany. You never have a reunification where you create a third kind of nation. There's always one nation that absorbs the other. So it's absolutely not possible to have South Korea absorbing North Korea. But not only because the regime in Pyongyang will never let it. It's because China will never let it. I mean, North Korea is a buffer state. It's the ultimate buffer state, and it's going to be there as long as China is going to be next door. I mean, you got to change China in order to. So I think this is a dream that the Americans, I mean, it's interesting you said Washington, because I mean, the Americans haven't a clue of what, I mean, they don't even know where North Korea is. Yeah. I mean, this is one of the areas where the Americans are mostly weak. So I didn't understand very well your question, but I think it refers to China. And I would say that anything that is going to happen, it will have to have the stamp of China. I do not see. So when we say about Donald Trump and all this stuff, he has to get the okay from the real guy that is ruling that region, and very soon the rest of the world, which for sure doesn't sit in the White House, but it sits in Beijing. So this is a gut feeling. Of course, I don't have any proof, but I have the feeling that China knew who Kim Jong Un was, that knew what he was doing, that although they didn't show any interest, or they actually show even weaknesses sometimes in taming him, I do not believe that Kim Jong Un has fooled Beijing, not for one single moment. So for now, my feeling is the Chinese are happy and they're okay. Now, of course, if there is a peace treaty between the North or the South, the Americans will have to move the THAADs from South Korea, and they have to move their fleet from right in front of China. So why would you keep a U.S. presence, such a really big military presence in the Pacific, if North Korea is not the enemy we'll have to hate anymore? So.
All right, so I'm not going to address the questions in the order they were posed. I'll start with the question about the Jangmadang generation and whether they might be some sort of breeding ground for opposition to the regime. And I think the indication so far is that they're not a breeding ground. Like, this generation is not full of regime challengers. They are simply trying to survive. However, they might be, you might call them a generation of regime, I don't know, people who are disobedient. They're not necessarily trying to challenge the regime by overthrowing it, but they are really stretching what's allowed in North Korean society today. So a lot of these young people in the Jangmadang generation, they are smuggling, they're breaking the law constantly, and they are selling contraband goods in North Korea, for example, South Korean popular culture, and they're selling contraband goods in China, perhaps not so much after China has really cracked down on its borders, and the borders have become much stronger. But anyway, it has very little respect for the law, and it's not really an ideological thing that they're trying to overthrow the regime, as I said. I mean, they're basically just doing whatever is possible to survive. And I also think that one perhaps unintended consequence of the North Korean state's decision to allow the markets without legalizing them is that you're making criminals out of the entire population. Like, every single time someone buys something or sells something at the markets, it's a criminal activity. So what you're doing is that you are basically showing that disobedience is possible in very small doses so far, but who knows where it could go. Like, now at least it's young people. They know that it's possible to circumvent the law in some regard. But I think in the long term, we shouldn't underestimate the the power of the Jangmadang generation and the potential they have to be a driver of change. And perhaps just I'll address one more question about reunification. I'll look at this from the North Korean perspective. So I think there are some significant veto players in North Korea against reunification. And I'm thinking specifically about the North Korean elites in the party and the military. Because imagine if North Korea were to reunify with South Korea. You would have all these generals and party elites. They would lose their power, because I assume that we would be talking about a reunification on Seoul's terms. That's the only realistic option. And if that happens, they would lose their power overnight and perhaps even be tried for crimes against humanity. So that's certainly not in their interest. And another veto player is the so-called donju, the new rich in North Korea. the entrepreneurs who have really become fabulously rich, even by Western standards in some cases, like they have very primitive businesses, and the last thing they want is a change in the status quo. So because they have no chance at competing with the mighty South Korean conglomerates. So I think reunification from a North Korean perspective is very, of course, there are plenty of hurdles, but there are also some significant veto players which we don't often talk about. So I think it's extremely perhaps unrealistic at this point.
Thank you very much, and thank all of you for showing up here tonight. We'll all follow the news closely in the coming weeks and months. Will Mr. Moon and Mr. Kim meet? And will Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim meet? Who knows? But at least it's an exciting time to watch what's happening on the Korean Peninsula and in East Asia. We have a lot of seminars coming up within the Asia program, so please check your inboxes. You're very much welcome to join us. And I want to thank first Loretta Napoleone for coming to Stockholm and giving this great presentation. Buy her book. I read it. It's a great read. It's available here outside. Thank you very much, Loretta. And also, I want to extend, on the behalf of Utrikespolitiska Institutet, my thanks to Ulf. Ulf has been living here in Stockholm now for a while, ever since he finished his doctoral studies in Berlin, but he will take up a new position in Japan at Soka University, so he will leave us soon, but we hope that you will be a frequent visitor to Stockholm also from now on. Thank you very much. Thanks.